As a wee boy growing up, I never really associated Glasgow with the paranormal. To me, Glasgow was a city forged in the fires of industrial revolution, gritty, tough, modern, and with a history that felt shorter somehow, especially when compared to places like Edinburgh and Perth. But I was wrong. You don't have to dig far to uncover some of Scotland's most fascinating supernatural stories, and many of them are right here in Glasgow. One of my earliest episodes looked at a haunting in Bear's Den, where the spirit of a strangely sharp-toothed girl was seen outside a first-floor window of a townhouse in the city's affluent suburbs. But the first supernatural story I ever remember hearing from Glasgow wasn't about a ghost at all. It was about a vampire. The Gorbals vampire might sound like something from a pulp horror comic, and in a way that's exactly where it started. But for the children of the Gorbals in 1954, it felt terrifyingly real. The story goes that a towering vampire said to be 7 feet tall, with iron teeth, was stalking the southern necropolis. This terrifying figure was accused of having kidnapped and eaten 2 local boys. Panic spread quickly among the children, who armed themselves with makeshift weapons and descended upon the graveyard in search of the beast. Hundreds of them. This wasn't just a rumour or folklore, this actually happened. Local teachers, clergy, and eventually the police tried to restore calm, but for several nights the terrified but determined children returned, convinced the vampire would rise again. What's fascinating is how this mass hysteria was shaped by a mix of urban legend, comic books, and genuine fear. Some grown-ups blamed imported horror comics, which led to calls for censorship in Parliament. Others saw it as something deeper, a glimpse into how folklore can still take root, even in the middle of a modern industrial city. For me, it was the first time I realised Glasgow had a darker undercurrent. Beneath the shipyards, sandstone flats, and steel railings was a city with a long and often overlooked history. A history shaped by industry, poverty, resilience, and at times fear. It's a place where imagination and experience blur, and where strange stories aren't always so easy to dismiss. And few places capture that better than Gibson Street. Glasgow's image has long been shaped by its industrial past, a city of shipyards, steelworks, and soot-streaked tenements. But its story reaches much further back. What began as a small religious settlement along the banks of the River Clyde slowly grew in importance during the medieval period, anchored by 2 institutions that would shape the city's identity for centuries. Glasgow Cathedral, built on the site where St Mungo is said to have founded a Christian community in the 6th century, became a powerful religious centre and a place of pilgrimage. Its Gothic spires still dominate the skyline of the city's East End. A reminder that, like all of Scotland's city, faith, death and mystery have always been part of its story. By the mid-15th century, Glasgow had gained another landmark, the University of Glasgow, founded in 1451. One of Scotland's 4 ancient universities, it brought learning, philosophy and debate to a growing urban population, and helped establish Glasgow not just as a centre of trade and industry, but of ideas. Though the university later moved west to its current site in Gilmore Hill, its legacy runs deep in the city's bones. These early foundations of belief, education and community helped shape a Glasgow that was never just industrial. It was also spiritual, superstitious, and rich in its own traditions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Glasgow had exploded into one of the British Empire's key industrial powerhouses. The city built ships that sailed the world, processed tobacco and textiles, and developed a reputation for hard work and harder living. But beneath the progress lay deep poverty and overcrowding. Rows of tenements packed with families created the perfect conditions for disease, hardship and stories. In areas like the Gorbals in Anderston, myth and memory lived side by side. The supernatural found a natural home in its close-knit communities, where unexplained events were shared by candlelight and passed down across generations. It's easy to picture Glasgow as all grit and sandstone, a practical modern city with no room for ghost stories. But as with the Bear's Den story, talk to the people who grew up there, and you'll often hear otherwise. From tales of haunted flats and phantom footsteps to full-blown poltergeist cases, the city has long had another side, a side rarely written into the guidebooks, but kept alive in pubs, kitchens, and quiet moments after dark. And in 1958, in a tenement flat on Gibson Street, something strange broke through that silence. Gibson Street sits in Glasgow's West End, a short stretch connecting Kelvin Way to Woodlands Road, close to the River Kelvin and just a stone's throw from the Kelvin Grove Park. Today it's known for its cafes, galleries and student flats, but its roots go back to the 19th century, when the area was developed to accommodate Glasgow's expanding middle class. The street took its name from James Gibson, a property developer and builder active during Glasgow's rapid Victorian expansion. Like much of the West End, Gibson Street was shaped by the growth of Glasgow University, which moved to nearby Gilmore Hill in the 1870s. And as the university expanded, the surrounding streets became home to lecturers, professionals, and eventually students. This kind of development was mirrored in Edinburgh, where areas like Marchmont and Newington saw rows of tenements and townhouses built to accommodate the growing middle class and the academic community around the University of Edinburgh. In both cities, education and industry worked side by side, with new housing rising quickly to meet the needs of a growing population. But while Edinburgh's historic heart was preserved in its medieval old town, much of Glasgow's growth was more modern, built on the back of shipping, commerce and raw expansion. Gibson Street, though small, reflects that difference, a product of Glasgow's ambition and energy during one of its most transformative periods. Its tenements were typical of Glasgow's red and blonde sandstone style, solidly built with high ceilings and shared stairwells. Many of these buildings still stand today, and while the area is now considered desirable, in the post-war decades it was more mixed, with ageing buildings, changing landlords and a transient population of renters and lodgers. On paper, Gibson Street was nothing out of the ordinary, but one flat there became the centre of something no one could explain. In July 1958, a strange story began circulating in Glasgow. 3 American students renting a tenement flat on Gibson Street reported something deeply unnerving. It was almost imperceptible at first, like many poltergeist cases. Just voices, muffled, low, and speaking in a steady back and forth somewhere in the flat. The sounds were easy to dismiss at first. Neighbours talking through thin walls, the creak and moan of an old building settling at night. The first time it happened, one of the students, let's call him Dan, was alone in the flat. The others were out and the building was quiet. The usual distant city hum dulled by the heavy summer air. He had just finished a letter home and was about to turn in for the night when he heard it. Voices. At first, naturally, he thought his flatmates had returned, but after a quick search he realised they weren't home. So he made the assumption that it had to be coming from the stairwell. In old tenements, sound travels in odd ways. But these voices weren't muffled in that usual, indistinct way. They were inside the flat. Low, measured, calm, 2 of them, going back and forth in a quiet exchange. He couldn't make out any words, but he could hear the shape of the conversation. A statement, a reply, a pause, then again. Dan stood still, waiting for it to stop. He checked the corridor again. Empty. He opened every door in the flat. Nothing. The voices continued, now behind him, now ahead of him. Never quite in one place, but never far either. As if the conversation was happening just out of sight. He tried turning on the radio to drown the noise out, then off again. That's when he heard the bang. It came suddenly, sharp and final, like a door slammed shut with force. He jumped. The flat was silent. Nothing had moved. When the others returned, he mentioned it, laughing it off as if it had been nothing, a trick of acoustics. But 2 nights later it happened again, and this time they all heard it. As the nights wore on, the pattern became harder to ignore. The voices were always the same, 2 of them, never raised, never hurried, quietly speaking to one another in a language or tone the students quite place. They seemed to come from just the next room over, even when there was only one person in the flat. The words were never clear, but the rhythm of the conversation was unmistakable. One would speak, then the other, a pause, then a reply, and the effect was deeply unsettling. Understandably, the students began leaving lights on at night, hoping to dispel the creeping dread that seemed to settle after dusk. Each time the voices were heard, they would abruptly end the same way, with a sudden, thunderous crash, like a door being slammed or a piece of furniture tipping over. But every time the students checked for the cause, nothing had moved. Doors were still shut, rooms were empty, no one was there. One of the students later described sitting frozen in his chair, waiting for the bang that he knew was coming, heart racing, cigarette trembling in his fingers. Another spoke of how they started sleeping with the bedroom door locked, not that it made them feel any safer. They weren't alone in the flat, that much they agreed on. But whatever was there wasn't trying to make contact, it was simply going about its business. Repeating something, reenacting something, and they were just in its way. Over the following nights, things escalated. The muffled voices were no longer the only disturbance. One evening, after a tense and silent supper, the students sat together in the living room, trying to push the unease aside. As the conversation trailed off, one of them reached over and switched off the radio. They were done for the night, too tired to discuss it further. They each went to their rooms, the flat falling quiet once again, but not for long. Moments later, from the direction of the living room, they heard it, faint music drifting down the corridor. At first they thought one of the others had turned the radio back on, but when they all stepped out, confused and bleary, they found the room empty. The radio sat in the exact spot it had before. The power switch still in the same position, but the music, soft, distorted, seemed to be playing from within it. One of them unplugged it and the sound stopped. They didn't speak much after that, just returned to bed, but none of them slept well. This kept happening, so they naturally assumed it was a fault in the wiring. They would turn it off, only for it to flicker back to life minutes later. In the kitchen, the activity took a much stranger turn. One of the students walked in to find eggs slowly rolling along the worktop, wobbling as if pushed by an unseen hand. The eggs didn't fall or break, just moved, deliberately as though being inspected. If that wasn't enough, on another occasion, a wooden breadboard suddenly launched itself from its resting place and crashed against the opposite wall, splintering slightly at the edge. No one was standing near it. Eventually they stopped trying to explain things. The rational theories, drafts, vibrations, sleep deprivation, no longer held up. There were too many moments, too many witnesses, and too much unease growing between them. The students began sleeping in shifts. Lights on, packed bags by the door. Within days they made the decision to leave. They didn't take much with them, just what they needed. Whatever was in the flat, they didn't want to take it with them. During their time in Gibson Street, word of the American students' experiences reached the press. On the 14th of July 1958, the Glasgow Herald, one of Scotland's leading newspapers, published a short but telling report titled Ghosts in Gibson Street. Though written with a dry wit typical of the time, the article confirmed several key details. The students had vacated their flat, convinced it was haunted. They claimed to have heard strange noises in the night, sounds that couldn't be traced to any ordinary source. One of the students was quoted directly. "I heard strange mumbling noises." It was a simple line, but it captured the heart of the case, a description echoed across many poltergeist reports. Voices, low and indistinct, emerging from the stillness of the night. The article described the supposed spirit with tongue-in-cheek, calling it a mild murmuring elemental, one that tampered with their radiogram and sent objects skidding from shelves. Egg boxes and breadboards, they said, were knocked from the kitchen surfaces with no one nearby. The oddness of it all was enough to drive the students out. Local residents, however, weren't convinced. Other tenants of the building admitted to hearing the odd noise now and then, but chalked it up to typical tenement life. Buses passing, neighbours talking, or a cat moving through the close. In true Glaswegian fashion, the Herald joked that cats pound through the closes with such a thunder of feet that anyone but a case-hardened Glaswegian could believe the place was being invested by heavy cavalry. The article ended with a wry suggestion. The students weren't haunted, just unacquainted with the peculiar sounds and rhythms of a Glasgow tenement. But the strange events on Gibson Street didn't end with the students in 1958. More than a decade later, another tenant would report similarly frightening experiences, suggesting whatever had stirred in the tenement hadn't been silenced, only waiting. In the early 1970s, climber Phil MacNeill moved into 39 Gibson Street. He knew nothing of the flat's history, and what he couldn't have anticipated was how quickly his life there would connect to something far stranger, an isolated Bothy in the Scottish Highlands, and a series of events that defies explanation. MacNeill had just returned from Louisbelt Bothy, a remote stone shelter near Kinlochleven. What should have been a straightforward climbing trip turned uncanny. From the first night at Louisbelt, MacNeill and his climbing partner had experienced a series of disturbing events that defied explanation. The Bothy appeared recently used, tidy, with every room in order except for one, a small bedroom directly above the living area. Inside, they found a disassembled metal bed frame leaning against the wall, open curtains on the window, and a large stone sitting on the windowsill. This struck them as odd, but it was late and they turned in for the night. Almost the moment they blew out their candle, the noises began. First came the sound of footsteps walking across the wooden floorboards above. Then they heard what sounded like the bed frame being reassembled, metal scraping and knocking into place. Not long after, the unmistakable sound of the stone rolling across the floor. At 4 a.m. the disturbances escalated. The room next to theirs erupted with crashing sounds, as though objects were being hurled around. When MacNeill tried to light a candle, it flew from his hand, hurled by an invisible force. Then came the footsteps again, this time heavier, deliberate. They sounded like they were descending a spiral staircase from the upper floor, heading straight towards the closed door of the living room. Gripping his ice axe, Phil threw the door open. No one was there. Rattled and convinced something was wrong, the pair escaped through a window. As they looked back, their head torches caught the upstairs window. The curtains they'd seen open earlier were now tightly drawn. MacNeill hoped the experience would fade with time and distance. Instead, it may have followed him home. The air at Louisbelt had felt heavy, claustrophobic, despite the open wilderness. And back in Glasgow, that same oppressive presence seemed to haunt him. And 39 Gibson Street was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. One day, while tidying the kitchen, he noticed something odd about the flooring. Slightly uneven floor tiles that didn't sit quite right. Pulling them up, he discovered a trapdoor concealed beneath, hidden in plain sight. His curiosity got the better of him, and he felt he had to know what was down there. As he opened it, there was a gust of old, stale air that smelled of damp wood and dust, like a room long sealed and undisturbed. It led to a small sub-basement he had no idea existed. Inside was a crude cross, fashioned from strips of old newspaper, yellowed, brittle, and carefully arranged on the floor in a way that felt deliberate, not accidental. Someone had made this. Someone had placed it here for a purpose. At its centre, a dark stain soaked through the paper, faint, but unmistakable. To MacNeill it looked like dry blood. He crouched closer, uneasy, noting that the newspaper dates were legible, seemed to span several years, cut and layered without any obvious reason. Some bore headlines about rationing and strikes, others mentioned accidents and deaths. All mundane on their own, but together they gave the impression of something built up over time, something built in secret. He didn't touch it, just stared. The cellar was silent except for the slow tick of a pipe cooling overhead. Then, without warning, there was a sharp crack from above, the sound of glass shattering. He rushed back upstairs to find a light bulb had somehow come loose from its fitting and smashed on the kitchen floor. Whether it was a coincidence or something else, he didn't know. But from that moment on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in the flat had noticed him noticing it. What's especially strange is the possible connection that emerged later. Research revealed that a man named John McAlpine, who died by suicide at Louisbelt in 1890, had once lived at 39 Gibson Street as a child. A coincidence perhaps, or perhaps not. Whatever the explanation, MacNeill's discovery added a new dimension to the mystery. One that seemed to stretch not just across time, but geography too. From the lonely hills of the Highlands to the red sandstone heart of Glasgow's West End, something unspoken seemed to link the two places. Something that had not finished telling its story. In 1984, Ghostbusters introduced audiences to a now iconic moment: eggs cracking and cooking on a kitchen counter. That scene, while fictional, was loosely inspired by real events, by the story of Gibson Street, where eggs were said to roll of their own accord across a quiet kitchen in Glasgow's West End. Accounts like this blur the line between fiction and reality. They remind us that the uncanny has a way of seeping into our stories, and sometimes into the lives of those least expecting it. But sometimes it feels like certain people are drawn to unusual places, and that those places in turn respond to them. Not everyone notices the shift in atmosphere when they walk into an old building. Not everyone hears the silence change, but some do. And once you've felt it, once you've stood in a room and known, without reason, that you're not alone, it's hard to forget. Maybe it's not just about belief. Maybe it's about awareness. Some people move through the world with a quiet openness, something that stirs the dust or lets the past be heard again. Phil MacNeill didn't set out to find a haunting, but something found him. From the desolate hills of Louisbelt to the tenements of Gibson Street, the sense was the same, unseen, unspoken, but there. And maybe the voices the students heard all those years before, soft, steady, coming from just the next room over, weren't travelling through the walls at all. Maybe the voices were rising up from somewhere hidden beneath their feet. Stories like these remind us that hauntings don't always follow the same patterns. They don't stay fixed to ruins or forgotten castles. Sometimes they echo between places. Sometimes they wait in kitchens, in stairwells, in the pages of old newspapers under the floor. And sometimes all it takes is one person walking through the door, someone open, someone paying attention for that silence to break. And when it does, what's left behind isn't always fear. Sometimes it's just questions. And in Gibson Street, those questions have never really gone away.